All right, welcome everyone. I'm gonna talk about best practices today for developing Power BI reports. Um, and my name is Gregor Brunner. I'm the founder of Brunner BI. We're a consulting and developing company focusing on Power BI in Switzerland. And I've worked with Power BI for a long time. And we mostly operate in the German-speaking areas. And we also built the external tool to Power BI, Measure Killer. So, what to expect today on this session? So, I want to talk a little bit about why we need best practices and what the whole point is. Also, who profits from them. And then we will dive into the technical details. We'll look at three areas. So we look at Power Query, the back end of Power BI, and see what we should do there, what are best practices that really help us. Then it's data modeling and DAX. And also at the end, we'll look at visualization best practices. If you have any questions, please let's just take them during the sessions. I know how it is, we forget things. And I think we can keep it really interactive. So whenever you have a question, please just raise your hand. There is a microphone that will go around because people are also here online, right? So we need to speak into the microphone so that everybody can hear us. What is this session not about? So I cannot really provide a full list of best practices. I will also talk about more that best practices are kind of subjective. There are some things that the community, I guess, agrees on, but still everybody has their own style. Some people focus more on this, some people focus more on something else. So I'm just gonna show you what I think is really important, my top 10 best practices for every technical area, but it's not gonna be 100 things because it's just, I try to prioritize and also rank the best practices by importance. So that's why I cannot tell you exactly what to do. Everything is a little vague in the sense that in some cases maybe some best practices are more important than others. And best practices are not a really one-fit-for-all approach. It also depends a little bit on what we want to do. So, why do we need best practices? Why should I care? As a developer, I'm building my report. I know what I'm doing. Why do I need to document stuff? Why do I need to have this extra work, right? So best practices can provide us with a clean and performant report, and also those reports, if we really comply with those quality standards, we can also make sure that those reports can live for a long time without breaking down, without becoming really messy. So I want to ask you, actually, who do you think, which person or who are best practices for? Any ideas? So the thing I can already say, it's not really for you as a developer right now. But do you have any stakeholders, any ideas who the best practices might benefit? The company? The company as a whole, yes? Future developers? What about the future you? In 6 months, you don't remember much, right? So then you will even appreciate it yourself that you fulfilled some of the things. Like when I look at some reports that I built 4 or 5 years ago, I'm pretty embarrassed, to be honest. I knew very little about best practices back then. There was also not so much on the internet like nowadays. So it's really good to at least start at some point because, yeah, even yourself, you will appreciate it when you open it up again a few months later. But could also be maybe a colleague that is filling in during your holidays, and then there's nothing documented, has no idea what's going on. And then when you come back, maybe, yeah, you will have a message from him. So it's really, it can be a couple of people or even the company as a whole that will really benefit from this. And if you're a consultant, of course, and you build something for a client, maybe the client cannot fully judge you on your level of quality, but at least the next consultant that opens up the report, and sometimes this happens, they badmouth them, they will see if you knew what you were doing, right? Just by, okay, if you comment some stuff in Power Query and they're like, okay, well, not bad, right? Because somebody put in the effort. So it's also really about the reusability, like I already mentioned, and also some best practices just tell us, okay, we should document things, and we'll take a look at exactly what that means. And so I already mentioned this, the community standard, right? But there are no 10 commandments, what you have to do, otherwise you're a bad developer. It's subjective. I like to compare the quality standards that we have in the Power BI community with like a language. It's ever evolving, it changes, and it's not, yeah, you can use a couple of different words, but they mean the same thing maybe, but it's constantly evolving, and it's not very exact. Yeah, so best practices are also an ideal. We have a limited amount of time. It's something that we strive towards. We want to do as much as possible with the time we have. I'm not going to say you have to do everything. I'm not doing that. Nobody can do that. We don't have 10 hours for everything to spend extra. So in reality, we have to do this trade-off between what is really important and what we kind of have to do, and then just find some kind of compromise, and then that's the best practices we might implement in a certain project. So it just means you don't have to fulfill all of them because time is limited. So here are the three areas again, right? Power Query, data modeling and DAX, and visualization. So let's start with Power Query. Here I have listed 7 best practices that I think are the most important. And it's ranked by importance as well. So I think the number one thing you can do when you build a new report, when you load data into Power BI, is to only load what you need. Now, in theory, it sounds great, right? But what's the reality of that? Does anybody have an idea already when you build the report what you will need? Any experience? Somebody maybe can. Has anybody ever encountered this problem with? Okay. So you build. So the answer was like you build something, and then the business or somebody whoever is asking for this report is just adding stuff, and you need to always add. So that actually goes in the other way, right? We want to start with something small, but we already start with something that is probably too big already, and we don't know yet what we will use in the report later on. It's not that easy to tell, because you also need to experiment a little bit, and then something will end up built in the report, and then maybe still people will add stuff. But so that's the theory and practice of this is really tough, and even though I think it's the most important one, it's really hard also to fulfill in some cases. That's why there's also some external tools that you can use that tell you basically what is used and what is not used. And by that I mean especially the columns, but also the rows. So we have a table, could be 20 columns, right? And do we really need all of those columns? But also we can look at the rows, right? We have maybe 1,000, 10,000 million rows, but maybe there is some in there in a certain column where we have like blank values or something, and maybe we don't even need that. So it's like horizontally and also vertically to only load in what you really need, because it will be more performant the less you load into Power BI. The second part is query folding. Who has ever heard about this term? So I guess around half the people in the room. Query folding is a feature that when you connect to something like a database in Power BI, it doesn't process the data on your laptop, but it basically sends the query back to the database and lets it do the heavy lifting. So it's a feature that makes everything faster, especially when you refresh the data, when you first load something in. And I can show you how this works. Let me just open the report here. So in my case, I have an Azure SQL Server, and we can see what this query folding is, when it works and when it doesn't work. So I'm just going to show you this quickly. So I have to go into Power Query, right? This is the transform data, and then basically it opens a new window. And now I'm in here where I have all my queries. I hope it's readable. It looks a little, is it okay all the way back? No, it's not okay. Let's see if we can change the resolution. Well, this we already tried before and it didn't work, so I guess I can only zoom in maybe. So here I have my queries. Is that better? Okay. Here I have my queries, and some of it just comes in from, I don't know, Power BI data flows, but here I prepared something for query folding. So actually, there are not even any rows here, but it doesn't really matter because what it's about is this applied steps here. So here you can see if the data source can produce, or basically Power Query can produce a native SQL statement. So if you right-click here and you see this View Native Query on, and then basically if you open it, you see some SQL statement, that means that query folding is happening. So whatever I'm doing here, it can send it back to the database, and then basically my computer doesn't have to do all the processing, but it just lets the database do it, and it's usually much, much faster. So now this is working, but depending on what I'm doing here, I can do some transformations, and then this will break. So some things that I can do in Power Query will break the query folding because it cannot send it back to the data source. There's a certain number of transformations that are supported, some are not. And I think the top rows, I don't know, I'm just putting in something. I think this works. Yeah, so here, and then it just select top one. This works, but then if I do remove, for example, bottom rows, that is something that always breaks query folding from what I remember. And now you can see it's grayed out. So it's possible that half of my query, the query folding works, and then at some point, because of some transformation I'm doing, it breaks. And then from that point on, your machine, your Power Query, or later the Power BI service, when you refresh it in the web, has to do the heavy lifting, and it will be slower. That's why it's a really important best practice to have this activated or on as long as possible, ideally until you're finished transforming your query. So just so that you saw this one time, and this right-click View Native Query is not the only, so this is not guaranteed. This is a very complex topic. The best thing is to check actually in the data source, in the database yourself, and you can see there if somebody is hitting it and sending queries. That's the ultimate way to check if it's working or not. Question? Right. Yeah, so in the data flow, it's really nice because you can see there as well if the query is folding, you can see up to which point. It's a little nicer UI. I think the Power BI Power Query is still a little older than data flow, so they don't have this fancy UI there yet. But yeah, it's an advanced concept, and the whole point that I want to make here is that you should be aware that something like this exists, and we can basically take advantage of things like this to make everything faster. Question? the question is, does Power BI do this automatically or you have to configure it? So it depends on the data source. So if you have a database, then Power BI will try to do it, but only if you do something that the data source can understand. Like the last thing I did, it couldn't understand, and that's why it broke at this point. But it will always try to do it if you have a smart data source or like a database in the background that can do the processing. If you do it on an Excel sheet, the Excel sheet is stupid. It doesn't know anything. It doesn't have any processing behind it. There's nothing really it can do, so it's never going to work. Excel rules. Sorry, Excel is not stupid. Okay, so the third one, I would say, is to set your data types correctly. That is really important, I think, especially if you work with Excel files. So when you import stuff from a database, it usually gets the data types automatically, so you don't really need to do anything. But if you import an Excel sheet, it might mess up all the data types. Power BI is also guessing, basically. It can auto-detect the data types, and that can be a really big problem also, because it only does this on the first 1,000 rows. So if randomly the first 1,000 rows have only numbers, it will do a whole number, but then maybe there's some text somewhere further down, and when you load this query, it will throw an error and say, oh, in row 1001, I realized there's an error. And so this is risky stuff, but it's also easy. But that's why I would say generally do it yourself, take the time and to really see what's inside those columns. And here I say avoid variance. So there's a data type when Power Query is not sure. It gives, so by default, it has a data type that is called variant. It has this ABC123 little symbol, and it can hold text and numbers in there. So basically, that is something you really need to clean up. You need to define a proper data type for that, because if you start loading this into the front end, it can create all kinds of problems when you start calculating stuff on top of it. So those are really, those default data types, the variants are really something we should try to avoid. Naming your queries is a really good idea. That, I mean, in Power Query, every table basically usually ends up being one, or every query ends up being one table, and you can group those together. A lot of times people group, okay, dim and fact tables. I'm still adapting to this. I don't like this categorization into dim and fact so much, especially in the more complex reports. What I started doing is I group the queries into where the data is coming from. Because a lot of times I have a database, I have SharePoint, I have some other stuff, and then I have 20 queries, and even if I know dim and fact, I still don't remember exactly which one is coming from where. And also other people, of course, they have no idea, right? So what I usually do now is I create a group for example, that's my data coming in from SharePoint, that's coming in from the database, because it also helps you organize everything a little better. But yeah, it's just about using those groups and adding some extra information there, basically. The fifth point is about naming the transformation steps. So we saw before that on the right side where I right-clicked for the native query, those are the transformations I'm doing on one query or one table. And those steps, by default, get a name from Power Query, but I don't think it's really good to leave it at that. So what I usually do, and maybe we can hop over to Power BI again. Wow, this is, oh, you cannot see that. So those are the transformation steps, and I'm gonna zoom in again here. Those are the transformation steps, right? And let's maybe look at something that has a lot. This has a couple. See, I am basically, there's a typo here, but you can just name those steps any way you want. And by default, they have things like, let's see something that has a default step. This is in German, actually, so I apologize about that. But yeah, so it really makes sense to give the transformation steps your own names. Basically, instead of, so for example, if I filter something, it says filtered rows. But what's that gonna tell me? I can just say, I don't know, take out current year or take out first year or something like this. So you can add some information there that will make it easy to understand what's happening, because otherwise I have to go there, I have to read the code. And if you already rename the step, you help everybody understand what you're doing. And if you have more complex transformations, so something that takes multiple steps, you can even say, I don't know, changing this from this with this like start and with end. So then I can see the transformation of this started here and then it took a few steps and then it ended here. So those are all some ideas that you can improve those applied steps in Power Query. And something else that is really, really important here is if you go into the properties, and that's where you can change the name, you can also add a description. So here I would imagine I'm gonna write what I'm doing, but that's not what we should do. We should say why we're doing it, because that's much more important, right? What we're doing, everybody can see it up here in the code. And what is more important is why we're doing it, because that's the information that a lot of people are maybe interested in, because they don't understand why you're doing this transformation here. It doesn't make sense. But if you're saying, oh, because of this and this, and then it's like, ah, okay, that's the important information we need to transmit, basically. So I can say I'm doing this because, and then you just hit OK, and then you can see we have this little icon here that shows that there's a comment now in that step. So that is something I think really, really important. Point 6 is to reduce the number of steps. So we don't want to have 20, 30, 40 different transformation steps. It's a mess. People struggle to understand. I mean, I've seen people do something and then they remove the whole thing again, so it was all useless actually, but they never cleaned it up, you know. And also there is a way to put multiple steps together, so you can also think about that. Yeah, in general, also the more steps you're making, the slower it will get, because it has to do all those transformations, right? So if you can compress it into less steps, it's also gonna improve the refresh of your model. Question?
When you're debugging why a query is taking so long, and there are lots of steps in the query, is there an easier way than doing extract all and then looking in each of the two queries that have been created to see which one is taking so long? Is there an easier process than that?
What do you mean by extract all?
Extract previous, sorry. You know how you can right-click and extract previous to make it into a upstream query that's referenced?
You're talking about optimizing the refresh time, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, so it really is, it's not that simple to answer, but first of all, you should, if you have really large data, and that's usually when it takes a really long time, you should try to have everything fold back to the database. That's the easiest way to have no trouble, right? Because then it's not up to you anymore. It will run on the database, and then that's the best we can do. If I debug something where I'm doing, I don't know, hundreds of CSV files and I'm doing everything itself, then probably there are some transformations that are more costly than others. So you can then maybe research that to find a more optimized way. I also heard the other day, and I think that makes a lot of sense too, that CSV files are more performant than Excel files. So I think if you export the Excel file to CSV, it will run faster in Power Query. But optimization, especially performance optimization, is a big topic. So Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks for your question. The last thing in Power Query, and we also have to look at the time, is to use remove other columns instead of remove columns. And that has really two important aspects. Who knows what this means? Okay, I'm just quickly gonna show this because I think it's really, really important. So if I have a table, let's take this table. I have a couple of columns, right? I have the option of either removing a column, and that's the remove columns operation in Power Query, or I can say remove other columns. And there's a huge difference between those two. Because if I remove something, it's generally not a really good idea. It's always good to select what you need and then do a remove other columns. Why? Let me go back to the presentation. So as far as I know, it has at least two benefits. One is if you get new columns come into the table in the database, for example, or in whatever your source is. If you only do a remove on one column, you will get those new columns in, and maybe you don't want them, right? So that can create problems. It will add more data for sure. So that's one aspect. The other one is if columns from the database or from your stores are removed later on, and you did a remove on that column, it will break. Your query will break down because if you do a remove column, it will reference that column name in Power Query, and if it's gone, it will create an error. So if we do a remove other columns, the cool thing is it only references the columns we want to keep. So it only throws an error if those don't exist anymore, and that's exactly what we want. So that's why there's a big difference between those two. So just select the columns that you want and do remove other columns. That's a really good way to handle it. Any questions in Power Query? Yes? Yes, in the UI, it's called choose columns, and then you have a menu where you can select, and then it will do a remove other columns internally. Yes, true. So data modeling, also a couple things. We have 20 minutes left. Okay. So imagine we did everything in Power Query. Now we're going to load our data into the front end. So there's one setting that is on by default, and it's really annoying me. Microsoft still has that in to make it very friendly for people who are opening up the first time. It's called auto date time. It's the local date tables. Yeah, there are a lot of names for this, but it's basically a feature that for every date column, so every date column that you have in your whole model, it would create its own calendar table in the background. So we have one report where there's 167 date columns in the model, and that's why it created 167 calendar tables in the background, and those have 90 megabytes. It's more than half of the size of the whole model. It's just those stupid local date tables, and they can be a real troublemaker. And the best thing, or the worst thing is, you don't even see it in Power BI Desktop. They're hidden. You only see it using external tools. And why that is because you can use quarter and you can use those built-in date hierarchies in Power BI. But if you work more on it, it will create a lot of problems, and it's blowing up your file size unnecessarily.
A comment from Adam online says, remove other columns as the added bonus of doing a column reorder in the same step. Just select the columns in the order you want them to end up in, and it remembers this as the order for them.
That's a great point. Yes, if the order you select them will create a new order of the columns without adding a step. That's a great point, right? Yeah. Thanks. So deactivating this auto date time is in the settings of Power BI. I assume most of you, can you maybe see some hands who knows this, or should I show it? Should I show it quickly? Okay, very quickly. So in Power BI Desktop, we have file, we have options, and then basically, actually, if you already have the file open and you started building, you need to do it in two places. We have the global settings, and we can see that's where it is in the global settings. So that means for future reports, but it will not take it out of this one unless we do it in the current file as well. So that's why if it's the first time you're doing it, you need to do it twice. Otherwise, they will stay in here and you don't even know. And you think maybe you deactivated them, but you didn't. I have Spotify here, that's weird. All right, so next, star schema. That's big best practice. It means we have dimension tables and we have one fact table in the middle in the perfect world. That's also something in theory, it's great. In practice, sometimes it's not so easy to achieve. But this is the best practice in terms of your model for performance in Power BI. Good. The next thing, number 3, to avoid many-to-many relationships and bidirectional filters. This is also part of the data model. Many-to-many relationships are really slowing down your reports, and bidirectional filters are, I'm not going to go into detail because we don't have so much time left, but it's good to hear about this and to make sure that only if it's absolutely necessary to do those. All right, next, calculated columns and costly virtual tables. So calculated columns are a really hot topic in the Power BI community. Some people are religiously against it and say, I want to get rid of this at all point. Some people say, in very specific cases, you can use them. Between those two groups, I would say I would use them. I would avoid them as much as possible. But in some cases, especially recently, we had something very complex and we needed to do something inside the data model. We couldn't really figure out how to do it in Power Query. So we built the calculated column, but it was only one. There are people who have hundreds of them, and that's probably what we should not do. So try to avoid them. And virtual tables is this something if I, for example, have an iterator function in DAX, so that's something that goes through the whole table column by row, and then I can use a calculated table inside that that will run slowly. So yeah, we have to be also careful here. That's also point number 5. Those iterator functions are great in a lot of cases, but they also can really slow down our measures. And number 6 says you shouldn't do any expensive calculations. So that's also relating to expensive DAX in our measures, especially on high cardinality columns. So for example, if you have a column that has 10 million rows and we have really long text in there or something, whatever you run on this column, try to use an efficient DAX formula, because if all the rows are different, and that's what high cardinality means. It means we have a lot of distinct values inside a column, and then if I run an expensive calculation on that column, it can run slowly in some cases. So that's also something we have to be careful about. So number 7, a measure table. So now we're getting to the things that are more like nice to have and they don't change so much maybe in terms of performance. But a measure table is, I create a new table. I usually do this with enter data. So you can also just enter data and just load the empty table basically. And then I create all my measures inside that table. So I have one empty table that holds all the measures. And the benefit of this is that all measures are together. I can also create folders in that table and even subfolders, so I can nicely organize those measures inside that one table, and it helps a little bit by just having everything nicely organized. And what we have done in our team is we started about a year ago. We started naming all our measures. The names begin with an underscore. As you can see here, underscore measures is also the name of the table, but every measure we start with an underscore. Why? For example, if I write some new DAX and I'm looking for a measure and I want to use that measure inside a new measure, once I hit the underscore, because normally it suggests a ton of things, right? But once I hit the underscore, I only have the measures left. So it's really easy to access them if you put in a special character, and only those measures have that name. Also, field parameters and calculation groups, those are part of the advanced features, I think, in Power BI. Those can really help you with your report. For example, calculation groups are very useful with time intelligence. Instead of building a measure for every year to date, last year, year over year, instead of building separate measures for that, I can build one calculation group, and then I can drag and drop the revenue and the profit measure in it, and it will basically calculate that automatically without the need to create hundreds of measures. And field parameters are really good to have them on the axis, and then the user can select basically certain fields, and the active value on the axis will change. So otherwise the axis is static in a visual, and I have to put in one field, and with field parameters I can basically create a dynamic axis. There's a little more in the model tab, and that's maybe something I can show real quick. In the model tab in Power BI Desktop, we can also create different pages. That's something I think I have not seen so much, but I think it's a great thing to do. Maybe let me make this a little bigger. So down here you can see I have tabs. And if I have a really big model, and some people have like 50, 100, 200 tables, it's like nobody understands this thing anymore. What you can do is you can create a new tab, and then you can drag and drop in, for example, just my calendar, and then I can right-click, add related tables. And then it creates a tiny version of that model. This is just visual. It doesn't change anything in the structure of the model, but it will create a tiny version that I better understand all the tables that interact with that calendar, that have relationships with it. And then I can see, okay, which in this case, which tables interact with the calendar. And I can create smaller versions of my model to better understand what's going on depending on the scenario. Okay, so formatting your DAX is also really good in hiding key columns and other columns maybe you don't want to expose to end users, because once we upload the models to the Power BI service and people create a live connection, those things will be hidden. And also commenting out your measures is a good idea. How much time do we have left? 10 minutes, okay, great. Visualization, not exactly my area, I would say, but still I collected some stuff. Here, I think what is important is to limit the number of visuals. That's probably the thing that has the most impact. And I just demoed something at our stand here, that there's a report with 1,100 visuals, 50 pages. Apparently, it was the most used report in the whole organization. But one page, the biggest page, had 267 visuals. A lot of information on one page. So, but that page took 1 minute to load, apparently. So, yeah, that's the extreme of it. If you can limit the number of visuals, it's great, because every visual, even if it's like a button or something, it will take some processing power to load. And a smart way to reduce the number of visuals, that is also not perfect, but it can help if you really want to have a high-end design. Instead of creating all those shapes and everything, you could add a background image that has all the design in there, and then it's just one image, and you can maybe take out 20 or 30 visuals from your page. But then, yeah, the background image, you have to update it regularly. It comes with caveats, but at least the report will be faster. So if you really want to reduce the visuals, maybe background image can help. Pie charts and donut charts shall be avoided. It's my opinion. A lot of people share this, but not everyone. I would say they're only allowed in very, very rare cases. And in most cases, they're not a really good idea. For example, if you have a pie chart and it's split into 10 pieces, nobody really knows which one is the biggest, the proportion of those pies. It's really hard to read for the human eye. I would say if you have like a gender split, maybe in some cases it might be okay. But yeah, try to not have too many of those at least. Because in a lot of books, only see pie charts. And this is usually not a really good idea. The colors, I think, are an important aspect of making a nice report. Don't use 10 different colors on one page. It's gonna look crazy. I think 3 or 4 colors are maybe the maximum we should do in an ideal scenario. There's also articles online which colors go well with each other. So some colors really complement each other. They look good. There's articles on this online. And custom visuals, number 4, is an important aspect. So we have those standard visuals in Power BI, right? But then custom visuals we can get through the marketplace, or we can build them ourselves in some cases. And they can solve some problems, or they can provide some value, but also remember that there's a security risk in some cases. So some of them can potentially send out data. We split them into certified and uncertified. The certified ones don't send out any data, but the uncertified can or could. And there's also more bugs, in my opinion, with custom visuals. They're just not used that much and could be developed by a third party. The standard visuals by Microsoft are better. Not perfect, but better. And performance is a topic as well. Usually custom visuals are slower than standard visuals. So only use them if it's absolutely necessary. And also your admins, the admins in your organization will appreciate it. For them, custom visuals is one of the biggest pains. Number 5, the visual headers. So that's something I think we need to take a look at quickly. So that's basically those little icons here. I'm gonna make it bigger. Those little icons here that we see, right? So some of them are important because we can drill down into the data. In the developer view, here in Power BI Desktop, I always see everything, but we can define them in the settings. And I have on object formatting and I'm confused here. They are here. No, are they? I guess it's here. Yeah, those are the visual headers that I'm referring to. And you can see by default, they're all on, and it's a lot of them. It means also, for example, if you don't turn them off, somebody can export the data potentially. And do you want that? So usually what's a good idea is just turning them off. If it's also, people can see which filter you have applied, and it might be something that you don't want to expose. So try to be aware of those, and yeah, only maybe use them if you really need to, and then just turn off the other ones, basically. Yeah, the filter, so number 6 is basically figure out where you want to put your filters, if you want to have them on top or maybe on the side, and then define a standard within your organization with other people. I know it's not that easy, but it will help people to, okay, the filters are always here, filters are always there, to avoid confusion and have some kind of basically design guidelines or style guide in your org. And then what we also did that I think I've not seen much is tooltips. So tooltips in Power BI is basically some extra information that we have on certain visuals. And you can see here, I have this little icons here. So basically we built those things here so that we show the user that, oh, there's much more to see. So this is a whole tooltip page, but it could also be something like this, right? That's a normal tooltip, and then there's a tooltip page. You can also, if you use that, I would recommend to use something like we did. I think it's really cool because it tells the user that there is something, because otherwise they have to go on every visual and try out and see if there's more, or maybe they will never do it. So what we do is this little one for the normal tooltips, the text ones, and this one we use for a tooltip page. It's just an idea, but maybe it's something that you can think about. And yeah, and then there's a little more. So we can also organize visuals in groups. It's some work, but it can also help you move around the whole block of visuals. Like if you have like everything organized in your filters section, you can just move all the visuals over. You can group them like in PowerPoint or something. And this top N for tables can be helpful for performance. So that's basically to limit the number of results in a table, because if you have thousands of rows in a table visual, nobody will really scroll. I mean, what's the whole point? So you can put a top N filter on that visual to just show maybe 100 items. The only problem is if you have a total sum, then it's not really a good idea, because the top N filter will also change the value of that sum. So then you will have the sum of the top 100, and that's maybe not what you want. Anyway, so yeah, that was it. Thank you so much. If you want to reach out, add me on LinkedIn, please, or send me an email. Thank you.